Yeah, my name is Dan Comerford. I'm the forestry supervisor here at Three Rivers Park District. I get to work in all the parks dealing with shade trees and forests. And I'm here to talk to you about insects and trees. There is a focus on beetles and tree boring beetles, but I'm going to talk about a number of different insects that we deal with in the park district. You're probably familiar with our district, seeing as you're sitting here, but here's a map showing our parklands in mostly suburban Hennepin County. Here over in Ramsey County is kind of the anomaly at Silverwood Park, but you can see we have a combination of park reserves and regional parks scattered through the county. My job and our job in the forestry section deals with both shade trees and forest stands. We get to have a foot in two worlds, kind of traditional woods forestry, but also arboriculture, or the individual care and maintenance of shade trees. Shade trees, as individuals, we value higher than trees in the forest because they provide more value to us. Shade for picnic grounds, aesthetics, and we have our own nursery where we planted plenty of trees around the district for shade. Speaking of which, this is our district nursery up in Hanover, Minnesota. It's an aerial photo, kind of an old one. We have a hardwood nursery of our own, meaning deciduous trees primarily. We propagate over 30 different native woody species, trees and shrubs, and we reforest quite a bit of land each year, generally planting about 40,000 seedlings every spring and around 10,000 saplings every year as well. And we're not making single monoculture plantations like you might be familiar with. We're not making pine plantations. We're trying to make balanced forests with a lot of shrubs and trees, primarily for habitat purposes. Some pictures of the growing ranges at the nursery. On the left of your screen there, you'll see a mechanical seedling planter. That's how we plant, the 50,000 seedlings each year. And then for our saplings, it's a little more labor intensive. They're hand planted into augured holes, and it does grow a forest fairly quick, but it takes a lot more labor. In addition to restoration and ecological reforestation, we also manage our landscapes and recreation areas. That's our administrative center on the left, and that's a picnic ground by the lake on the right. Our tree-lined picnic grounds are what we're known for, and we really value the canopy in the picnic grounds. And finally, we do ecological restoration. So taking woodlots or forest ecosystems and improving them if they're impaired. Sometimes that involves planting, sometimes not. But you'll see here's some images showing different understory removals and stream bank stabilizations. We like dead trees too. Dead trees are essential. Living trees are important, but just as important, if not more important, are the snags and the dead trees in the forest. If you think about it, it's normal for trees to die. The vast majority of all the baby trees will die before they reach adulthood. It's just how it works. And even in death, they provide a lot of ecological service. This is from a journal article, and it's showing conifers, but it kind of gets the idea of the decay classes we'll see with standing dead and logs on the forest floor. Sometimes the biomass in a dead tree can be greater than the biomass when it was alive. If you add up all the cells of the lichens and the invertebrates and the vertebrates who may live upon it. This is out of an ecology textbook, just showing how even when a tree doesn't look like its typical healthy form, it's still providing a lot of service all the way as it dies and then even in death. And then finally, lying on the ground, coarse woody debris, it's known in forest ecology, provides a lot of habitat, a lot of areas for fungi to grow, but also other tree species. And then many animals will make their homes or find food in the down logs. Borrowed this graphic just to give you a brief overview on tree anatomy, because when we talk about insects and trees, we need to know what parts of the trees the insects might eat. Trees have organs just like animals. You're probably familiar with the different parts of a tree. And if you think about it, they have different nutrient levels. If you were going to eat something, The leaves, I mean, as humans, we eat leaves, lettuce, for instance, but leaves are generally pretty digestible, provide a good source of food for insects. The disadvantage is an insect on a leaf is very exposed to predation from other animals. Fruit, in this case, acorns of an oak tree, that's another food-packed part of the plant. If you think about it, seed has to provide the nutrients for that growing tree. They are also chock full of nutrients for any hungry insect. The disadvantage to seed feeding is the time of the year. It's not like there's seeds on the tree all year long, so it really only is a food source for a short period of time. And then finally, you can see the cutaway of the trunk there, and that's what I'm going to focus on, because there are insects that eat different parts of the trunk, the stem of the tree. A little bit of tree anatomy. This is a cross section of an oak stump with a little diagram. Hopefully you're fairly familiar with the structure of a tree. Wood in the middle, otherwise known as xylem. It's primarily dead. Think of it as a whole bunch of microscopic drinking straws that are the transpiration stream of water is going from the roots through these drinking straws and evaporating out through the stomata of the leaves. You might be familiar with tree rings. Trees put on a ring each year. Where that new ring is growing, the kind of reddish color you'll see there, the vascular cambium, that's where cells are differentiating. And every year, cells on the inside of the vascular cambium are growing another layer of wood, and cells on the outside are growing another layer of inner bark or phloem. And the two main parts, transportation organs of a tree, the xylem, which is, like I said, is the wood transporting water, and the phloem, which is a very thin layer of the inner bark, which is transporting nutrients, most of the products of photosynthesis, sugars that the leaves have made through photosynthesis. Just another diagram to kind of really hammer home the inner structure. And phloem, as you might guess, is a little more nutritious than other parts of the trunk, certainly more nutritious than the xylem. You can see here, this is an American beech tree that beavers have eaten the inner bark. Even human beings in time of starvation have found inner bark as a starvation food. I know linden trees are used that way. And here's a little pie chart I borrowed showing the diversity of life on Earth and how insects dwarf most other forms of life on a species level. They are so diverse, and there are so many different insects in this world, dwarfing the other animals, the plants. It's really mind-boggling when you think about how many insects there are out there, and how diverse and how amazing they are. And they kind of don't get enough credit because they're tiny. If they were the size of livestock, if they were the size of cows, I think they might be everybody's favorite animal. I mean, when you look at them under a dissecting microscope, they're amazing. I mean, the different colors, the different organs, the different mouth parts. Mouth parts of an insect are crucial. It basically determines how that insect survives. You might be familiar with butterflies that suck nectar. Bees and houseflies that might cut and then lap up blood, or beetles, which have jaws, chewing mouth parts, beetles, grasshoppers. Let's see. Just as important as the mouth part of the insect is what life stage of the insect. We all learned at a young age that butterflies start as caterpillars. But what I know I missed when I was a really young child was that's true for many, many, many insects. It's not just Lepidoptera, it's not just moths and butterflies. Many insects have what's known as complete metamorphosis, where they have an immature form, a larval form that is drastically different than the adult. And they have some sort of transformation through a pupa and become the adult. And for instance, for many Lepidoptera, the adult, the showy part of the animal's life that we're all familiar with, is kind of less important. It's usually a shorter period of their life. The vast majority of their life is spent as a larval caterpillar. That's when they're doing most of their feeding. That's when most of the impact on the landscape happens. I mean, some insects, giant silk moths, for instance, don't even have functional mouth parts as an adult. That really disturbed my children when I first told them that. It's basically they're alive for a few days. They can't really feed. They're there to mate and produce the next generation. And here's an image showing the life stages of a beetle. This happens to be a Japanese beetle, but similar to how a caterpillar will change into a butterfly. You'll see the eggs, and then the larvae. We might know them as grubs, and then the pupa, and then finally the adult. The life stage dictates the damage they might do to our trees. So many beetles that we are concerned about, the grub stage is when they do a lot of their damage. You can see this zoomed in photo here of the mandibles of the grub, and it's consuming the adult here. This is an Asian longhorn beetle. We have the adult in the upper left corner, and then a grub on the right, showing the damage done. So when we talk about how we want to manage insect infestations in the park district, we base our management on IPM, integrated pest management. It's a blanket term that this diagram sums up most of the key components, but in a nutshell, it's a coordinated program to address pests in a responsible and sustainable way. So rather than just going out there and spraying the entire landscape with a broad spectrum insecticide to kill every insect, we would never do that. We have a tailored response, and I'm going to go through some of the aspects to an IPM program. Number one is prevention. Like many problems we face, prevention is the easiest. We don't have to fix a problem if it's not there yet. So usually prevention, when it comes to insect pests and trees, would be preventing the importation of that insect. Often some of our most damaging insects are non-native, and one of the ways they are most easily vectored is through firewood or any wood. Insects that feed under the bark can be hard to know they're under there unless you're a wood wasp or a woodpecker that can detect them. Most human beings don't know if there's insects residing under the bark. And an insect might be able to fly a few miles in a day. Certainly can't walk that far. But if it's in a piece of firewood and it gets thrown in the back of a pickup truck, it can travel 500 miles in a day. And many, many insects have been moved around this country much faster than they normally would have through firewood transportation. So in this state, Department of Agriculture regulates firewood. The kiln-treated firewood is heat-treated to a temperature where there's no insects surviving, and you can buy kiln-treated firewood, which is by far the safest firewood if you're going to transport it around. Unfortunately, it's kind of all too often, trees die from the pest, and then no one wants to waste the dead tree, so what do? You make firewood out of it. But unfortunately, sometimes you transfer the firewood somewhere else, and then you're just basically that the pest hitchhikes along. Another key component of an IPM program is monitoring. We have a monitoring program for forest health that involves aerial surveys flown by helicopter. Primarily, we're looking for signs of oak wilt, and I'll describe oak wilt in a little while. It's a particularly deadly disease of our oaks. But while we're in the air, we're also monitoring for other issues that might not be apparent from the ground. Sometimes the first issues show up on the crown of a tree. It's a lot easier to see it from the air. Other monitoring could involve trapping, sentinel trapping, either traps that have specific pheromone lures for certain insects of interest, or sometimes just sticky traps that might just intercept any insect that might be out there. The next critical component of an IPM program would be proper pest identification. We don't know what to do or how to handle it if we don't know what insect we're dealing with. So often it involves microscope work. Perhaps this is an insects drawer showing pinned insects. Might even have to consult with experts. Some of these insects, especially the smaller ones, can be quite tricky to identify. And sometimes the features used to identify them can be almost ludicrous. The length of the third spine on the second joint, or how pointy the elbow is on this portion of the insect. So sometimes we do have to rely on experts. Not all injury is the end of the world. Insects are really important. they need to eat. Half the reason we plant forests is to feed the animals out there, and that includes insects. They're some of the most important animals out there. They're the base of the food webs. And so not every sign of damage is the end of the world. Many plants can tolerate it. Here's an example of Japanese beetles defoliating a leaf. If I saw that level of defoliation all across the canopy of a valuable tree, for instance, a tree that had a critical role, like in a golf course or a campground, that would be approaching a threshold where we would want to take corrective action. A tree can't survive consecutive bouts of defoliation like that. Trees can shake off a surprising amount of stress, but it's cumulative. And just like an animal or human being, you start stacking stresses on top of each other and across time, and finally it's too much, and the tree will finally die. Contrast that with the oak on the other side of the screen, showing a gall formed by an insect is an example of completely tolerable impact. That gall is not really affecting the vigor or the life of the tree. If anything, it's kind of interesting to look at. Perhaps maybe in a botanical garden setting or in somebody's front yard, they might have an aesthetic concern, but we don't. And that's an example of an insect living in harmony with a tree where we don't have to do anything, just nature. After that, there's different pest control tactics. Pest control tactics are not just picking up the can of Raid and spraying the insect. There's a lot of different controls, starting with cultural controls. Cultural controls would be, geez, this tree is really suffering from a certain insect because this tree is in the wrong place, or this tree is in this very humid microclimate and it's getting really pestered by an insect that thrives in a humid microclimate. Let's adjust the microclimate, maybe transplant the tree, and that's an example of a cultural intervention that might solve the problem. Mechanical interventions would be, let's say half a portion of the tree is encrusted with scale insects, which are these tiny, often armored little insects that encrust a branch. Sometimes we might cut off those branches and prevent the spread, prevent the insect from moving to other parts of the plant. And that's an example of a mechanical control that might lower the pest level. Chemical controls we're all familiar with. We do have some chemical controls in our arsenal. They're often expensive, can often have non-target effects, and we try to minimize it as much as possible. That being said, there are times when chemical control is the best option for us. An example I show on this slide with the tubing there with an ash tree is the injection of a systemic insecticide into an ash tree to control and kill the larvae that are under the bark. The illustration on the right side of the screen shows our vibratory plow. It's a big bulldozer with a big knife blade in the back that's stuck into the ground 5 feet deep. And we use that to cut roots around infected oaks to prevent disease transmission. So that's an example of a mechanical control. These are some of the controls I just mentioned. I should have mentioned do nothing. Often that's the best answer. We can just observe and do nothing. I also neglected to mention biological controls. Biological controls are living agents that might hopefully control your target pest. There's obviously risk involved. You don't want to make a problem worse by introducing an organism that is then going to have other issues. But certainly some of our most effective sustainable controls have been some of the effective biological controls developed. It's not really a great insect example, but purple loosestrife, it's a wetland plant that you might be familiar with, a really great success story about how biological controls have really suppressed that wetland invader. And then finally, I wanted to go through a number of the specific insects we deal with in our parks, kind of what is common between some of them and then what we might do with them. I'm starting with some weird ones. This is larch case bearer moth. It's a non-native insect, meaning it did not evolve here, co-evolve with the tree and plant species. When organisms co-evolve together, often they over the millions of years, they kind of work out a equilibrium and can live in harmony. Okay, this insect is going to eat a little bit of me, but not too much. However, when you have two organisms that evolved in completely different parts of the world, and then all of a sudden you put them together, you don't know what's going to happen. And often they don't get along, and often one really suffers it. And large case sparrow is an example of a moth. It is non-native, but it was actually introduced, gosh, I think close to 100 years ago. It's only when populations really build that it's a concern. It feeds on larch, tamarack, which is a deciduous conifer here in Minnesota. And it's kind of an interesting insect. It actually, one of the first things it does as it's a larva is bites off a needle, hollows it out, and then wears it kind of like a hat or a little house. It bears the case. It kind of hides itself in there, and it can be really hard to see until you start seeing the needle defoliation like you're seeing on these trees. We don't have many larch in the park district. We do have some. They're a component for some rare wetland ecosystems, and we also have them in some of our landscapes, in some of the wet areas, and some of our golf courses, for instance, where we have treated with insecticide, contact insecticide, basically for mostly aesthetic reasons. As you can imagine, golf course aesthetics is valued highly. Another foliage feeder is the spongy moth. Up until a couple of years ago, it was known as the gypsy moth. Again, another non-native introduced pest, but similar to large case sparrow, it was introduced long ago. My home state of Massachusetts is where it was introduced. A gentleman who was attempting to improve silk production. They escaped from his backyard, and they've been spreading to the U.S. ever since. Minnesota is right on the invading front as they come from the east. They're not all over Minnesota, but they're certainly detected every year. We put out the Department of Agriculture puts out traps, and we participate with them, and we trap them in our parks, and we do find them occasionally. And then the Department of Agriculture, if they determine that there is a critical threshold and there's a population building, a reproducing population, they will apply BT, which is an agent that can control them. They'll apply it from the air. I mentioned Japanese beetle earlier. I'll talk about it a little more. A beetle where its early stage is a grub that lives under the turf, under the grass, and it does a lot of its feeding in the scrub stage of grass roots. Many of us will have these in our lawns. They really thrive in the greenest, healthiest grass. So the grass that's fertilized and irrigated, like golf courses, is great. The roots are really appetizing to these beetles. And when the grubs become numerous enough, you'll get whole patches of grass that die, and all of a sudden you can almost roll up the turf because all the roots are cut off. And then when they finally emerge, then they're also destructive as an adult beetle, and they're a defoliator. They go after many species: wild grape, linden leaves, and many of our vegetable garden plants too. In terms of control, we very rarely see levels of tree defoliation that would be of concern to treat this insect. The areas that might be treated in the park district would be for turf concerns. So golf courses might apply a soil-based insecticide to kill the grubs if they're killing too much of the turf. This is a weevil. A weevil is a type of beetle with a long nose. This is an example of a seed feeder. And that's of a concern to us because we grow a lot of oak trees. And we grow I should have mentioned when I talked about our nursery, we grow all of our stock from seed. We collect seed from Hennepin County primarily because we really want a local genetic source for our future forests. A native pest of acorns is the acorn weevil. You can see a little hole there and a little larvae that fed inside the acorn. It's a waste of time to prepare the acorns and put them in the dirt if they're going to die anyways. So often you can use a bucket test and separate them out, floaters and sinkers, and really rapidly determine which ones are viable. This is another native insect. It's a wood-bearing insect, phloem feeder. So phloem is the inner bark. This is the two-lined chestnut borer. You can see the two lines on the adult there, and then the larva, the grub, is a segmented white grub that lives under the bark and creates galleries, which is the feeding tunnels that you might see as the evidence left behind by the insect. in the picture with my hatchet there, I've peeled off the bark, and it can be a little hard to see, but in a healthy tree, that would look like, similar color to the chairs you're sitting in. It would be a healthy, lighter color with insect galleries. It's a native insect. It's supposed to be out there, and it thrives on stressed trees. So this co-evolved with our trees, so it's not a death sentence. It's not destroying every tree in the forest. It actually, similar to how a animal predator might feed on weaker individuals, thinning the herd, so to speak, kind of fills that niche in nature. So in a forest, trees are racing to the sun, and you have winners and losers in any situation. And the trees that are getting overtopped are suppressed. They have less sunlight to make their food through photosynthesis, and they're the weaker individuals. They're the runts, and they have less reserve energy to fight off attack from an insect. And so often you'll see these trees that are shaded out and suppressed will be the ones most colonized by this insect. Then you add on abiotic factors like 3 years of a drought. All of a sudden, all the trees in the forest are stressed, not just the ones who are losing the race. And we've seen a definite increase in this insect over the past 3 years of drought. Not a whole lot we can do about this insect. It's very prevalent. Far too many trees to treat with insecticide. Our best tool is prevention and cultural controls, such as keeping the forest healthy. And what we can do to keep the forest healthy is minimize. We don't want to make things worse. So minimizing our impact through root compaction, machinery, other things that might just layer on another layer of stress, we try to minimize, especially in times of drought. Here's another phloem feeder. This is the flat-headed apple tree borer. It's a native insect. You can see why it gets its name from the larvae. It's again a segmented grub, but with that big flattened head. With a very healthy tree, this insect, it's hard to find. Even if it isn't a tree, it might have one or two boring under the bark. It's not really doing much damage. However, we run across it with stressed trees, and a common stressed tree for us is new transplants. As I said, we plant a lot of trees for reforestation. We also plant a lot of trees in our landscapes, and they often are installed with a tree spade, which is a giant truck that digs up the whole trees and then plops them in the ground. But like any plant, when you take it out of one environment and put it in another, it takes a while to kind of figure things out. It's called transplant shock. It's lost a lot of roots in the transplant process. And so for the first couple of years in the landscape, trees are very stressed out. They're in a weakened state and have less reserves to fight off an insect invasion. Any plant, trees in this case, has a balance of available energy. So they're making their own food. They're autotrophs. They're making their own food through sunlight. They're using water and nutrients from the soil and carbon from the atmosphere, but the true driver of it is the power of the sun. And with all that energy, a tree or any plant can kind of do one of two things with it. It can grow or defend. So often the fastest growing plants, they put most of their energy into that growth, but don't have as much energy into the different ways they might defend against insects. In contrast to species that might be slower growing, but have a lot more protective components. And for a tree, that would be phenols or terpenes or chemical constituents of the plant that insects don't like to eat. That could be just constitutive. They could be just part of the plant at all times. It's bitter or it's spicy. But there could also be induced responses. So conifers might have resin flow to push out an insect that's trying to bore in. Or a hardwood tree might create more of a certain chemical once it's been fed upon by insects. But getting back to flat-headed apple tree borer, this is the image here showing a crack and then a little bit of galleries in the exposed sapwood. We find that a lot in our recently planted trees. Not a whole lot we can do about it other than cultural controls. And so that would be making the tree as happy as possible. So follow-up watering and mulching. Bark beetles, another phloem feeder. They're tiny. That's a very magnified image. A bark beetle is much smaller than a grain of rice. Often they're called shot hole borers. You'll see it on some pine trees and just looks like it's been sprayed by a little tiny shot. And again, many of the bark beetles are native, not usually a problem until you have a tree that's already predisposed by some other stress. Drought is a common one. And often in conifer trees, which we don't have a whole lot of in the park district, bark beetles, the way they overwhelm a tree's defenses is through a mass attack. And so all of a sudden you'll have every bark beetle around is colonizing this tree, and it finally becomes enough to overwhelm the tree's defenses. Not a whole lot we can do about this insect. And again, we don't have much of a conifer resource to be too concerned about. Emerald ash borer may be the boring insect you're most familiar with because we're dealing with an ongoing invasion here in the state. It's a non-native insect that arrived in the United States, probably in wood packing material from Asia. It did not co-evolve with our trees. So our trees, in the big picture, have never seen this insect ever before. All of a sudden, there's this very dangerous insect. The trees have no defenses. And as you can expect, it's really been devastating to ash trees. There's more ash trees in Minnesota than in any other state. It's a very common tree. You may not have been familiar with it 5-10 years ago, but many people have become familiar with it as they see them start to die all around them. And they realize, oh, that was an ash tree. That was an ash tree. It's a really common tree in the woods. It's also extremely common in the landscapes because it was planted, because it was a really great tree to plant in urban areas. It can deal with pollution. It can deal with compaction. It's a fast grower. In the 70s, Minnesota lost many, many, many of its previous perfect urban tree, the elm, in Dutch elm disease, and unfortunately replaced it with many, many ash. And when all of your eggs are in one basket, there's a lot of risk when a pest comes around, and that's what we're dealing with here. It's a phloem feeder. You can see the larvae in the vial in the upper left. Feeds in galleries beneath the bark. Eventually, it severs enough of the phloem that the tree can no longer transport its energy, its food around the tree, and then that's what finally kills the tree. It's called emerald ash borer because it's a brilliant emerald color. It's a beautiful adult insect. It's the least important life stage of that insect. It's not adult for very long. The adult, mates and lays eggs. All the damage is done by the larvae. I've been dealing with emerald ash borer for over a decade, and I can probably count on one hand the number of adults I've seen on an ash tree, and I've lost track of how many larvae I see everywhere. That's an example of an ash tree that's blonding. You can see that it has very light colored bark, and a lot of the bark is ripped off and lying at the base of the tree. That's done by woodpeckers. It's a behavior sometimes known as scaling, and they're searching for the larvae under the bark because that's what woodpeckers like to eat. It's a great protein source. And they will systematically pull off all the bark looking for the beetle. It's so striking that this is often what we see before we see the beetle itself. It's sometimes known as biosurveillance, but basically we can deduce the presence of this insect through the actions of another animal. Here is another beetle of concern that is not known to be in the state of Minnesota. It's a xylem feeder, which is less common than the phloem feeders. As you can imagine, there's less nutrition in the wood than in the inner bark. If you had to choose one to eat, not many of us would want to eat wood. There's not much nutrients in there. However, the advantage is it's very protected. It's hard for an animal to find an insect buried in the wood. This is the Asian longhorn beetle. It's known, its name is from its very long antennae. And it's a large insect. And like many of these beetles, it does its damage in its early life stage as a larva. And you can see how it's bored straight through the tree, making it look like Swiss cheese. So in addition to severing the transport of nutrients in the tree, it's also just structurally weakening the tree. And trees will snap in half. As you can imagine, when it looks like Swiss cheese like that, it's not too strong. This is a very concerning insect to a lot of forest managers because it is non-native. So most our trees haven't co-evolved, but also it has an extremely wide host range. Many insects specialize on 1 or 2 species. Emerald ash borer attacks ash. We have 3 or 4 species of ash. but it's not going to get anything else. Asian longhorn beetle isn't nearly as picky. I could go on and on with the species. Many species that we plant. Maples are one of the most common. But the concern is if it gets here, it's not just dealing with one species. It's kind of going to pester the majority of our trees. Preventing it from getting established is the most important. There's a quarantine in areas in the country where this insect is known to exist. USDA APHIS, federal group that deals with invasive insects like this, considers it such a threat that they've been dumping enormous resources. They have tree climbers, so when they find an area where it's been detected, they'll cut down the tree, cut down trees nearby, send tree climbers systematically in all the nearby trees to see if those trees have it. It basically cut down any tree that is a risk, and sometimes cut down possible hosts that aren't even infected yet, just kind of scorched earth tactics to make sure that it's really been stamped out. They really take it seriously. Oak wilt. Oak wilt is a complex that is a pathogen, a fungus, and an insect. The fungus is what kills the tree, but the fungus can't get into the tree without the insect. In this case, it's nididulid beetles, these picnic beetles. We're really lucky they don't have chewing mouth parts. You remember I was mentioning the mouth parts. So they can't really bite their way into a tree. However, if humans let them in by pruning the tree in April, May, or June, or if there's a windstorm in April, May, and June, these nididulid beetles love the sap that comes out of those wounds, and they can smell it from miles away. They can detect it within minutes, will fly to that, start lapping the sap, and if there's any spores from another infected tree, that's when the spores come off the insect and then infect the oak tree. It's a vascular disease that moves inside the tree and can kill a red oak in a matter of weeks. This is not my diagram, but it shows basically how nididulid beetles would smell a tree that's already infected and then vector it, meaning transfer it into other trees. And then it's extra bad because many oak trees have root grafts that are connected, and the disease within one oak tree can move from tree to tree, similar to bloodborne pathogens in an animal. Dutch elm disease is very similar. I mentioned it earlier, especially in the late 70s is when it first arrived in Minnesota. It's a vascular wilt and kills elm trees. This is, again, a fungus that is vectored on a beetle. The bad news here is this beetle does have chewing mouth parts, and so it doesn't require a human cutting a tree. Basically, if the bark beetles have the spores on them, they're going to chew in small twigs in the canopy, and that's how the fungus is going to get into the elm tree. You'll see often on dead trees, you'll see this kind of butterfly pattern of galleries. That's classic for the bark beetles that feed under the bark in elm trees. The eggs were laid on that kind of vertical central line, and then as each egg hatched and it was a tiny little grub, they all started chewing outwards, and it made that butterfly pattern. And that is basically all I had time to talk about. Welcome any questions you might have about how we handle insects.